Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us also in Berlin. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, two segments today, as usual. The second half of the show will be focused on D-Day, the 80th anniversary of the Normandy landings that are happening this week. We'll dig into the economics of that fateful battle in World War II in the second half. But first, we have another data point for you. That is 34, which is the number of counts of falsifying business records that former U.S. President and current presidential candidate Donald Trump was convicted on several weeks ago.
Following Trump's conviction on 34 felony charges last week, speaking at a campaign fundraiser in Greenwich, Connecticut last night, President Biden said, quote, "For the first time in American history, a former president that is a convicted felon is now seeking the office of the president."
Trump and his allies are ratcheting up their calls for revenge against Democrats in response to Trump's conviction in his New York City criminal trial. Some examples.
Mike Johnson is laying out a plan to take on the Justice Department following Donald Trump's conviction last week. During a news conference yesterday, Johnson announced a three-pronged approach to curb the DOJ's authority, using legislation, congressional oversight, and the appropriations.
Those 34 counts, each of them was a Class E felony that is punishable by a fine or up to 4 years in prison per count. We'll soon find out what the exact punishment he faces is at his sentencing in a few weeks. But the crimes at issue here were all of an economic nature. As I mentioned, they involved falsifying business records. Basically, Trump was convicted of submitting phony invoices for legal services, ostensible legal services, to cover up reimbursements for $130,000 worth of hush money payments to the adult film actor Stormy Daniels. Yeah, so we thought we'd unpack the crimes that Donald Trump is now convicted of and, more generally, the economics of the campaign he's involved in right now. So, Adam, to start off, I thought I'd ask, why is, false business record keeping a felony? Felonies are, the most severe kind of crime one can be convicted of. It sounds like it could be a relatively innocuous crime compared with violent offenses. So curious if when did administrative malpractice earn the attention of the criminal justice system?
Well, I think the criminal justice system, saw criminals and their lame excuses coming and said, if you commit a misdemeanor with a view to obscuring a much more serious crime, then the misdemeanor is itself a serious crime. And that's the prevailing legal understanding in the state of New York, where Trump has been tried and found guilty. So that's the logic. You're absolutely right. The record keeping, falsification, and so on could easily, and of course in the vast majority of cases when it happens, be simply a misdemeanor. But in this case, it was clearly done with the intent to cover up what was a serious violation of American law. And so that's why it's raised to the level of a felony. Because otherwise you could imagine people would construct like nested chains by which no one ever committed anything other than a misdemeanor. But in the end, somebody ends up dead.
It is interesting that sort of business records are something that the state is interested in. It's not just a private kind of exercise that businesses are involved in keeping records. Obviously, at some point, these become objects of public scrutiny. And I'm sure as, an economy gets more complex, that becomes more and more the case. But
oh, absolutely. Yes, that's clearly the underlying logic here, is that if you're going to, and this is one of the big problems with white-collar crime, right? It's not a smoking gun kind of offense. And so records are essential to keep, and failure to keep them could just be, as you say, an accident, or it could be clear evidence of criminal intent.
Yeah, in this case, the underlying crime that you're referring to was a violation of campaign finance law. The hush money payment was intended to cover up an affair that could have disrupted the original campaign for the presidency in 2016. This raises all sorts of questions about how U.S. presidential campaigns are financed to begin with. And I'm curious, how does the way that these campaigns are financed compare with the system in other countries? It's obviously, notoriously more expensive to run for office in America. Are the finances in the U.S. at least any more transparent? I mean, are there any relative advantages that the American system has, or what does a comparison reveal?
I mean, they are relatively transparent, and what the transparency in the American case shows is just how much of a sham the effort to regulate American campaign financing is. I mean, so much so that I think to describe it as a regulated system is kind of absurd. So there are rules, the most important of which is that any one individual can only give any one candidate $2,600. In other words, you aren't allowed to openly buy a politician by just, giving them $1 million and telling them to get on with it. Though candidates like Trump, when soliciting funds from oil men, have come pretty damn close to precisely that. Right? He had this famous encounter a couple of weeks ago where he basically said, look, $1 billion for my campaign will be cheap given the benefits I'm going to rain on you. But setting that kind of thing aside, in the US, any one person can only give any one candidate $2,600, but you can organize a lot of people to each give that amount, and you, as a rich individual, can give that amount to a number of politicians. You can also give to parties. You can contribute essentially unlimited amounts of money to so-called independent organizations that then campaign on issues, but only indirectly for a particular candidate. Corporations can give money. There's no public funding for candidates that's really worth applying for, and there's no limit on advertising. And so when you add all of that up, what you end up with is a system in which we can transparently track that about $14.5 billion was spent on the 2020 election in the United States, of which a minority, actually slightly less than $6 billion, went on the presidential campaign, and the rest went on congressional campaigning. But $14.5 billion to conduct the American elections of 2020. Now, that is unusually expensive. It isn't the most expensive, and I'll come on to the most expensive one in a minute, but it's unusually expensive. And it's interesting why others don't spend as much. And it isn't simply because of regulations. So, Germany has relatively few restrictions on giving money to politicians. But there's ample public funding and there are limits on advertising. And so you end up with a low-level equilibrium in which it really just doesn't make sense to pump billions of dollars into German political campaigning. It's not obvious that it really yields any benefits. And clearly, in every respect, why would anyone want to foster an American-style system? Because what it essentially does is to turn what should be a democratic race into a race for money, and it allows the weight of economic and social inequalities to manifest themselves in the electoral system. And the only economic benefit that you get is, a large, overgrown, overpaid system of political professionals who feed off this flow during campaign years of billions of dollars. I mean, the money stays in the US economy. It's not wasted. It's just, is this really a sensible allocation of talent? And does it distort the political process? And it clearly does. The only country which has a system which is, in fact, by the latest count, more expensive than the American one, is perhaps unsurprisingly the biggest democracy in the world, which is India, where elections now cost more than they do in the US. I think it'll be a surprise if the recent general election in India didn't, in the end up costing $16 billion. And this is in obviously a much, much poorer society. And it's first of all, it's a hotly contested political system. So it's one where you actually have to fight for votes, as Modi has discovered to his cost, with a very disappointing result. It's a huge country, so obviously elections are going to cost more. But they have created an entire structure of corporate donations. They have vast advertising spending. And they have more or less open electoral bribery. So votes in India are more or less openly bought and sold in exchange for cash handouts and doling out liquor. And the consequence of this is, as you would expect, and is true of the US as well, a hugely distorted system where the median wealth of winning candidates in the 2019 elections was 16 times higher than the candidates that they beat. and those themselves are much richer than your average Indian. And if you ask who in society, in a vast, teeming society like India, has this kind of money to spend, it's often people with connections to organized crime. And nearly 30% of the winners in the 2019 election in India had serious criminal cases filed against them at the time of their victories, compared to 13% of the competition. So it's a system which encourages, shall we put it the most neutrally, ruthlessness to the point of the willingness to stretch the law, the mobilization of resources and systems, and reinforces structures of hierarchy and inequality, even within the context of, what is in other respects, of course, an extraordinarily impressive display of mass democracy in a society which remains far poorer than the United States. So these problems are not confined to the US, and it is important to get the perspective right. The United States is no longer the most expensive democratic political system in the world.
Wow, good to know that there is a country out there spending more on its elections. I'm envious right now watching the election in Britain and how mercifully short it is. Just a few weeks from the calling of the election to the actual vote itself. Meanwhile, we'll be slogging through this for several more months, obviously, in the U.S. But to return to Donald Trump himself, he's now an object of the criminal justice system, and I'm curious. Yeah, how much generally does the U.S. spend on its criminal justice system, and how is that compared to other countries?
Well, somewhat to my surprise, I concluded that from the evidence I was able to gather, that the United States doesn't actually spend more than other places. I say that with a degree of surprise because I experienced the US as extremely heavily policed by excessively equipped police officers. And of course, it's notorious for having a huge and overgrown carceral system. But as far as I'm able to figure, the US justice system, and these are data from the Department of Justice, costs the equivalent of about $305 billion a year. And if you ratio, then that was in 2021. And if you ratio that to US GDP, that's about 1.3% of GDP. And that appears to be almost exactly the same as what is spent in the EU. And if you look at large European countries like France, they also seem to have a remarkably similar rough breakdown between the different components. That's between the police, the judiciary, and prisons. And if you look at costs per prisoner, they also seem to be roughly similar in the $40,000 to $50,000 per prisoner per year. So I think the way this works is essentially America uses its higher GDP per capita to incarcerate more people at roughly the same cost. If America incarcerated fewer people, then its higher GDP per capita and the similar costs of incarceration would enable it to have a lower bill for justice. But instead, its preference reveals itself in incarcerating more people at the same price in an otherwise more productive economy. And so therefore you end up with very similar levels of spending.
I mean, and so also then the implication of this is basically the United States is using its greater economic strength to imprison more people, but that's not indicative of any kind of philosophical.
Well, we know it is. I mean, the choice to. I'm just figuring out how I make the ratios work, because I thought maybe the spending was the same and America incarcerates more people, so they spend less per person in jail. That doesn't seem to be the case. And putting people in jail is hugely expensive. Like famously, it's more expensive to keep somebody in jail than it is to send them to Harvard. It's about $50,000 a year. Probably Harvard costs more. All of the colleges cost more. Anyway, but you see the point. Like, it's hugely expensive. And that appears to be the kind of number everywhere. It appears to cost that much, whether you look in the UK or France or Germany, somewhere between 45 and 50,000 euros, pounds, dollars per year. And so how do you make these numbers add up? Well, the answer is that if that's a fixed cost and America is more productive, then for the same share of GDP, America can have more people in jail. And that's apparently how you make these numbers add up. But I was genuinely surprised. I really thought America's spending would be considerably higher, notably on the carceral side, as on the share of GDP. It doesn't appear to be that different. Certainly not orders of magnitude or different worlds. Broadly speaking, quite similar. So we may be wrong, and I really, if some listener is an expert on this, but the figure I see again and again and again is ballpark $305 billion for all different levels of government. And that is, roughly speaking, exactly the same percentages in Europe. So, broadly speaking, it seems like a plausible number.
To turn to a final question here, I wanted to ask whether what's unusual in the Trump case is simply the fact that a white-collar crime was getting prosecuted at all. It does seem like one hears so relatively infrequently about white-collar criminals, even though one assumes there's a lot more white-collar crime out there than one hears about. So does the United States approach white-collar crime categorically differently than other types of crime? And is that itself typical of other countries as well?
So I think it is, broadly speaking, it's a class-based sociological kind of phenomenon. The idea of white-collar crime was first coined in 1939 by criminologist Edwin Sutherland. And it's, broadly speaking, describes crimes to do with business and government, and in the name itself, it suggests that it's different from blue-collar crime. It's a somewhat misleading kind of, it's easily misleading because it's not the same thing as a white-collar criminal or blue-collar criminal. So blue-collar people, lots of people with high school education or less, commit white-collar crimes, though they themselves are not white-collar. They tend to get caught a lot, and when they are caught, they suffer slightly more severe punishments than genuinely white-collar people committing white-collar crimes. So we have to distinguish between a crime, which is essentially to do with business, money, fraud, and so on, and the person perpetrating the crime or found guilty of perpetrating the crime. If you look at federal arrest and criminal records, then it appears that white-collar crimes in the strict sense account for about 12% of federal arrests. The big categories of violent crime at one end, immigration and drugs. Those are the really big ones. They're about twice as significant in the record. So it's not, white-collar crime does get prosecuted. Fraud gets prosecuted all the time. It is one of the crimes for which, when a case is referred to the prosecutor's office, it has a relatively slight chance of being carried forward to trial. So only about somewhat less than 40% of criminal referrals for white-collar crimes actually go to trial or to prosecution. The percentage is much higher, say, for immigration cases, for narcotics, where in the case of narcotics, 73% of cases referred to the prosecutors are actually then, carried forward. In the case of weapons, it's 68%. So for white-collar crime, it's not quite half the probability, slightly more than half the probability of actually moving forward. This has a lot to do with the complexity of the cases. White-collar crimes are difficult to try, and obviously the prosecutors have to decide what they have the greatest chance of achieving success with. And what we have seen over time in the US is quite a marked and alarming fall in the number of federal prosecutions for white-collar crimes. This does go to your point that Trump is to an extent unlucky to have found himself in this case. So as recently as 2010, 2011, the US was prosecuting about 10,000 white-collar crimes a year, and the figure is now down below 4,000 a year. So it's more than halved. It's really quite a dramatic fall. So these cases that's 4,000 a year. So, it's 15 a day. It's not as though these cases aren't being brought to trial, but certainly not on the same volume as drugs cases, immigration cases, cases of violence and the use of weapons. And that no doubt has to do with the sociology of the system. And this goes all the way down to the average punishment to be expected if you're found guilty of a crime, of a white-collar crime. If you're white and college educated, your chances of getting a prison sentence of 4 years or more are quite slight. If you're black or you have poor education, your chances are much more serious of actually finding yourself in jail.
Yeah, interesting, that sociological aspect. And it does seem like sometimes people in these so-called white-collar businesses are surprised to even hear of prosecutions. It's as if it's like sort of unsporting to call out criminal activity.
The standard defense, apparently, in white-collar trials consists of two things. Is the misdemeanor argument. In other words, I didn't know what I was doing. Whoops, sorry. And the other one is, well, everyone in my business does this. You're so naive to imagine that I was doing anything wrong. Everyone does it. So it's rather different from murder trials, where you basically have to say it wasn't me. In this case, your argument is either, whoops, I didn't mean it, or B, everyone does it.
Yeah, great. So, exactly. That the criminality is so rampant that you can't be expected to be held accountable for it.
Somebody made a mistake in even designating it as criminal. Don't you understand? This is just how business is done.
And I suppose the same goes for hush money payments to adult film actors. So
I think it's a deep level. I think it's quite an important part of the Trump shtick, right? There's two versions of his argument. A, I'm innocent. I'm a very innocent man. That was his original response. And the other one is more that, that famous line he did during one of the presidential debates, where it's like, I know about tax evasion because I'm, the king of tax evasion. And so, which is much more in the latter mode of, hey, everyone in the know knows how this is done. You're just stupid if you get caught. Like that comment he made about prisoners of war. He didn't, had no respect for John McCain because he doesn't like soldiers who get caught. That kind of hard-boiled, tough guy, which basically is saying to liberals, what are you doing? This is so asymmetrical. You're all you're all crooks too. You're just calling me and you're just victimizing me, which is rather different from saying I'm innocent.
Sure. Yeah. Vote for me. I'm a felon. We'll see how that goes over this year. But we have to take a break here for now, but we'll be back in a second to talk about D-Day. Welcome back. The next data point is 80. As an 80th anniversary, it was 80 years ago that the Normandy landings took place, June 6th, 1944, the date of the Allied invasion of Normandy, sometimes referred to as Operation Overlord or Operation Neptune, in the U.S. typically referred to as D-Day. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history at the time, resulted in the liberation of France, more generally contributed to the downfall of Nazi Germany. Yeah, we thought we'd try to look at it from an economic perspective as Europe gathers to commemorate the anniversary. So, Adam, first off, I thought I'd ask whether D-Day was decisive in some sense in ending World War II, or alternatively, was the real decisive action in the East, conducted by the Soviet military, despite all the kind of nostalgia over D-Day.
Yeah, so this is an argument that rages back and forth amongst professional historians. And, the basic metric here, or one basic metric, really is staggering statistic, and it's also the number 80. But in this case, it's the fact that by our best estimate, 80% of the battle casualties of the Wehrmacht, of Hitler's army, were inflicted not in the West fighting the British and the Americans, but on the Eastern Front, 80%, so 4 out of 5. And that, at one level, says everything you need to know about, where the main struggle was conducted between the 22nd of June 1941 and all the way down to May 1945. Over that extraordinary protracted period, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army just delivered the most serious heavyweight bout in military history, bar none anywhere in the world ever. I mean, it's just a rolling series of massive campaigns, 2 big waves of German invasion, and then counterattack after counterattack after counterattack across a gigantic, just look at the map of Russia. If you go visit Moscow, who knows when we'll do that again, but if you did go to visit Moscow, I went to see the World War II Museum, and they have this hall there which is filled with the books which commemorate Russian casualties, over 20 million. And it's truly extraordinary to see the level of casualties, all the way down to the last moments in Berlin when, Russian infantry squads competed with each other, Soviet infantry squads, I should say, because they came from all over the Soviet Union, not by any means just from Russia, competed with each other to be the last men to risk their lives to capture the German parliament building. So 80%, that's the metric we need to start with. And even in the month of D-Day, so D-Day on the 6th of June, on the 22nd of June, so for the anniversary of the German invasion, the Soviet Union launches a far larger ground offensive against Army Group Center, holding down the central bit of the German front, and essentially destroys that in a gigantic, sweeping, month-long campaign. So arguably, even in military terms, even in June, the month when D-Day happened in 1944, the action on the Eastern Front was more significant. But I think we shouldn't downplay D-Day too much. There's too much, one could go too far in this kind of revisionism. And I think maybe the best way to think about this is that D-Day didn't by itself decide the war, but it decisively shaped when and how the war ended. I mean, crucially, from our point of view, of course, what it did was to ensure that it wasn't just the Red Army, it wasn't just the Soviet forces that invaded Germany, but it was British and American troops that got there, and they occupied much of West Germany. And they met Soviet forces in central Germany in May 1945. I mean, and if the British and the Americans had tried to fight their way up from the south, from Italy, which they occupied in 1943, or through the Balkans, it would have been much, much slower. And in the process, of course, what they also did was to draw very high-quality German troops to the West. The air war, in any case, is overwhelmingly Western-driven through the extraordinarily high-intensity bombing campaign the British and the Americans waged against Germany from 1942. And in terms of industrial production, 40% plus of the German war effort goes into aircraft, not manpower, but aircraft construction consumes 40 to 45% of the German armaments production. So that's a huge drain. But one shouldn't also discount the quality and numbers of troops that were sucked into the Normandy campaign. There were very, very high-quality German tank units and Panzer Grenadier units fighting against the Allies in 1944 that get consumed and destroyed on the Western Front as well. It's not on the same scale as the East, but it's significant. And that, of course, accelerates the pace of Soviet advance as those troops are drawn away. So it becomes this fascinating race between a war that's been waged in the sky and on two different fronts on the land, which then culminates in Germany's defeat and stupendous casualties in 1945. About 1.5 million German soldiers are killed in the first 5 months of 1945, 1.5 million. There's 1 month where they lose over 500,000 men in a single month because they're basically being chewed up from both sides on the ground and through tactical and strategic air power. It's absolutely devastating. We think of the Japanese as being the kamikaze nation, right? But the Japanese had the sense to surrender before we invaded the home islands. The Germans didn't. They fought to the absolute finish. There were only dead German bodies between the Americans and the Soviets when they finally met. Only dead people. So the German defense has this suicidal quality as well that shouldn't be underestimated. And it takes this double meat grinder to get us to the final conclusion in the spring of 45.
Wow, some grim numbers involved there. I did want to ask, though, what the economic factors were that helped produce the victory in the Battle of Normandy. Were there special technologies developed among the Allies that organized D-Day? Was it fundamentally a matter of extraordinary logistical organization, or was it more a matter of coordination between the state and industry, or was it just the sheer scale of production that went into the run-up to D-Day?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And at one level, it's a reiteration of what I've just said in the Allied war against Germany. And this is typical of democracies when they fight wars and they're trying to minimize casualties against essentially a suicidal opponent that has no business continuing to fight you because it's clear the war is over. So why put any of your democratic citizens in harm's way? So the thing that you do is to create a very sharp spear and support it with absolutely massive firepower and just bludgeon your opponent to death with massive capital-intensive warfighting, which is the air war, summarized, right? But the thing about D-Day is it's that on the ground. So D-Day is clearly the most capital-intensive campaign ever waged because it involved the huge logistical operation, this extraordinarily ambitious amphibious operation. We think there were about 50,000 German troops on the ground along the relevant beaches at the moment of the invasion. The Allies attacked them with 6,000 ships, 1,000 aircraft, and managed to get 133,000 troops onto the beaches on the first day. 24,000 of them dropped from the air, right? So this is absolute overkill. And you can take that kind of risk because you know you have massive material superiority, right? That's part of the logic of the war in the West. And so that's the basic determinant. We see this in all of the Normandy films, right? There's that moment when Germans wake up early on the 6th and sort of train their binoculars on the sea, and the fog begins to lift, and all of a sudden they realize, oh my God, like, look what's there. And it's this giant fleet which is about to open up on you and erase you. So it's this terrifying scene. But to get onto the beach was itself a huge technological operation. And it's not, it's all very well to cite all of these numbers. And the Allies did more or less well with this problem. So at one level, they were extraordinarily inventive. They built the Mulberry Harbours, which are floating concrete, massive, gigantic concrete boxes that were floated, filled with air across the channel, and then filled with water and sunk onto the beaches to create basically a breakwater. They experimented with high-pressure petrol pipelines to pump petrol, because these were so mechanized, the Western armies, more mechanized than the armies anyone's ever seen before, that they needed huge amounts of petrol. How are you going to get that there? Well, they thought they would use pipelines to do this. In the end, neither of those technologies proved to be terribly decisive, because the beaches themselves were just more efficiently managed than anyone had reckoned, and they managed to just land huge quantities of petrol that way using very primitive technologies like jerry cans. On the beaches themselves, in the fighting, there were a whole variety. I mean, I grew up with the sort of mythology of what were known as the boffins, which were, specialized. In the where people will have seen this culture is in the James Bond movies, where there's always a moment where James Bond gets taken to meet what's he called, the technician, and he's come up with some new weapon that's about killing your enemies with a. This is all from World War II, so that's a deliberate spoof in British culture of the boffin, who had created the gadgets that were like bouncing bombs, or floating harbors, or flail tanks that would mash minefields with giant kind of rotating flails of steel balls, or tanks that could lay carpets that you could go up the beach, or tanks that had flamethrowers for destroying German bunkers. Unfortunately, what the Allies didn't spend much time on, and this is where there's a really profound technological failure, is actually on the level of combat. Not on the first wave, but on the next phase, because the Normandy campaign has 3 phases. Get onto the beach, that's the first couple of days. Then what you've got to do is survive the counterattack, which is going to come from high-quality German troops that have been held in reserve. And then you've got to break out and then charge across France. This is where Patton comes in, right? And the crucial problem they had is in the second phase. Because in the second phase, the Germans mobilized crack divisions, tank divisions, SS divisions from the Eastern Front that fought with superior technology against British and American troops who just had never encountered anything like this before, and didn't have just the basic kit like competent middle-sized tanks. Sherman tanks were very, very poor tanks in comparison with what the Germans were able to mobilize. And so there's this middle phase where the campaign gets stuck for week after week after week. And then finally the dam breaks, after the Allies have thrown everything at the Germans, including strategic bombing of tactical targets. So you basically fly giant aircraft over a tactical target and try and hit it from the sky. And then the Allies break out, and it's this very rapid advance across France. And at that phase, they start innovating again. So what you see is really the first kind of modern linkage of tanks with tactical aircraft. So they would have what were called taxi ranks of aircraft that would hover over the armored columns, and all of the tanks would be equipped with radios, and they could call down relatively precision, because tactical air power is never very precise, but relatively precise strikes on German positions ahead of them, which had never been done before. Like the Germans had done relatively coordinated blitzkrieg tactics, but not with direct radio contact, where the tank units could call a radio station that would then direct the pilots onto a target. No one had ever done that before. So as it were, the breakout phase and the initial landing are quite impressive. It's the grinding fight in between, which is where the D-Day campaign really disappoints.
So then finally, I thought I'd ask what D-Day teaches us about amphibious operations in general. Obviously, these days, a lot of people are thinking about a potential invasion of Taiwan. Does D-Day teach us anything about whether that is realistic?
Well, one thing I read online made a really funny point that we should never use the word D-Day as an analogy, because D is like deliverance. It's a happy thing. What we should call this scenario is Z-Day, which was apparently the coinage that, obviously that reminds us now of Ukraine, but it apparently was coined by Churchill to describe the horrible scenario of the Germans trying to invade Britain in 1940. So imagine a Taiwan Z-Day, and how would it go? I mean, I think what D-Day tells us is that it's incredibly unlikely that competent Chinese military technicians will seriously attempt to do this, because the Taiwan Strait, if anything, is wider than the channel. It depends on where you go across, right? If you pick the right point, it could be narrower than the D-Day terrain. The D-Day landing is not at the narrowest point of the channel. It's about 100 miles. But of course, if you're operating a huge invasion fleet, you don't go point to point, right? You actually have to stage people. And the fundamental thing that you need for a successful amphibious operation, if it's not going to be like a commando style thing, and D-Day was anything but commando style, right? The fog rises and the Germans see the 6,000 ships, right? This is not commando. We're coming and you're not going to stop us. You can only do that if you have complete naval superiority. There were literally just a few German attack boats with torpedoes on them, like marauding in this space, but no serious naval opposition and more or less complete air superiority. And again, there was virtually no German Luftwaffe presence over the beaches. There was some, but it was not heavy and not serious, and the Allies massively outnumbered them. You know, when you hear about airborne troops becoming casualties, it's not because they're being shot down by German fighters. It's because of mishaps and dropping in the wrong place, and it's a inherently high risk operation. So basically, from the side of the air and the sea, the D-Day operation was very, very safe. And the opposite would be the case if you were trying to do the Taiwan Straits operation, because the Chinese would be going into the teeth of massive American naval power. The Americans couldn't put their own ships there because it's too close. And what's totally changed is missiles and, as we know now from the Ukraine war, drones, which is the bit of the Russian military that has been most vulnerable to Ukraine. It's the Navy, surprisingly, even though the Ukrainians don't really have a Navy. It's because they are very vulnerable to missiles and drones. So the chances of the Chinese being able to put the kind of number of troops across the straits that they would need to seriously challenge the Taiwanese, who, you know, are not under-equipped and do have a reserve structure. And apparently, if you know the geography of Taiwan, you'll know that there are hardly any decent beaches for them to land on that side, unlike in France, where you've got these wide open spaces. I mean, which don't offer much cover, but certainly don't pose any real difficulty for getting ashore. It would be like one Omaha beach after another in Taiwan. So I just think what it tells you is the serious military operators on the Chinese side would not take this seriously.
Okay. For a variety of reasons, we hope it doesn't come to that. But we will have to leave off here for now. But as always, we'll be back next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.